Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us in this latest episode of CHACR Take Away video interview series with an expert on a question of importance and relevance for British Army and Defence. Obviously, these are views shared between two academics and experts. They don't reflect the views of the Army or the Ministry of Defence. And today we're discussing India. Obviously, we have a traditional history and an attachment to India, but its geopolitical significance, its developments have been one that we've been following closely. And subsequent British governments have sought closer relationships with India, including the current one in defence, in education, in foreign direct investment and trade. And the recent developments on the question of India and China have raised a lot of questions again about what is happening, where things might go. And today we are thrilled to have Dhruva Jaishankar, who is a leading expert on India, Indian foreign policy and its global and regional posture. He was a fellow at the Brookings Institution in New Delhi, and now he's launching a new US program for the leading Indian think tank, OIRF. And so we're thrilled to have him and his opinions on all these matters in Unpacked. Dhruva, I'm just going to ask the first question to really set the scene on particularly ongoing tensions between India and China. Obviously, what we have observed last week was really worrying, the level of fatalities and escalation. We haven't seen this in more than 40 years. Is this the start of a new era in China-India relations? And what has happened? What is the nature of dispute between that border that seems it hasn't settled yet for a few decades?
Right. Thank you. Thank you for having me on. No, the India-China boundary conflict is actually a very complex issue. It dates back to the 1950s following China's annexation of Tibet. And one of the things that the two countries found, and this is the first time China and India had been in direct, had a direct border between the two of them, was that they really didn't have a very well demarcated border, that this is very hostile terrain. It's high in the Himalayas. And the two countries hadn't quite agreed where the boundary lay between them. Some parts were somewhat demarcated, mostly between British imperial diplomats and Qing dynasty, the Qing Empire. But there were questions about how these two new countries, the People's Republic of China and the Republic of India, how much they accepted what they had inherited from these countries. So a combination of things in the 1950s led to a gradual increase in tensions on the boundary. Partly both sides were pushing to claim as much territory as they could. In the 1950s, China built a road in what India considered Indian territory. And this was a very strategically important road because it connected Tibet and Xinjiang, both at that time very restive regions. A number of things that included, and as well as questions about Tibet. There was an uprising in Tibet in the 1950s, eventually led to the India-China border clash of 1962. There were earlier clashes, 1959. There was actually something quite similar to what we saw just last week. Fast forward a little bit, the 1962 war, in some ways, was a watershed event. China got the better of it, managed to claim more territory in what's called the western sector in Ladakh, where we recently saw clashes, but withdrew largely in the eastern sector, which was seen as in some ways a tacit acceptance of India's positions in that area. What we saw then was a very uneasy peace, but from the 1990s onwards, starting in 92, 93, we saw India and China starting to reach a series of agreements which was not about settling the boundary, but protocols as to how to behave when when the military from both sides actually met each other when patrolling. So there were wide areas still where along the border which were still disputed, where Chinese and Indian soldiers occasionally met, but they had established a set of protocols as to what to do so as to maintain a peaceful boundary. And so the result of that is that from 1975 to 2020, you had 45 years basically where there was no bloodshed on this boundary, despite it being a boundary dispute the size of Bulgaria. So it's quite a significant boundary dispute. What has happened in the last few years is we've seen a gradual increase of number of standoffs between the Chinese and Indian military forces. 2013, there was one. 2014, 2017, there was one that was slightly more complicated because it involved Bhutan, actually. It was a China-Bhutan standoff where India intervened to support Bhutanese forces effectively, or Bhutanese territory. And then we've seen this one. This is basically, in this year, we've seen one of the largest mobilizations by the PLA, the Chinese PLA, in a long time. And so it's quite a serious standoff. At 4 points, there was a sort of India-China standoff. On June 6th of this year, there was an agreement to de-escalate. And actually, before I get to that, I should mention one of the reasons we're not quite sure why is China mobilizing its in such strength. But one of the at least approximate reasons appears to be India playing catch up in terms of its infrastructure building on the boundary. So China has, since the 1990s, China has done a much better job of being road building, bridge building in this very hostile terrain. India is now playing catch up, which allows it to mobilize much faster. New airstrips have been activated, for example. So that may be one of the at least proximate reasons for this buildup. There was a standoff at 4 points. On June 6th, commanders met. They decided to roadmap to de-escalate. That de-escalation was taking place when on June 15th, something went wrong. They're different. The Chinese and Indian accounts differ as to what exactly prompted this, but led to a large-scale brawl. Many people falling down these rocky hillsides into a fast-moving, very cold glacial river. And unfortunately, it has led to the deaths of 20 Indian soldiers, including one very senior officer, a colonel. And the Chinese appear to have accepted that there were casualties on their side, although they haven't released and are unlikely to release the numbers and names of those who were killed and injured. But in any case, this is quite significant because it's the most serious. First time we've seen a loss of life like this since 1975, the worst violence since 1967, when there was a clash between India and China. So I think that's the sum and substance of it. Where does it go from here? I think it really has hardened public opinion in India about China. But I think we'll have to see now whether the de-escalation plan, which was in progress earlier, whether that continues or not. Currently, it doesn't look very likely, but I think there'll be attempts to try and resuscitate that.
Dhruva, I think it raises a really interesting question, isn't it? I mean, obviously, traditionally for Indian defense and security policies, the question of Pakistan has dominated a lot of the public discussions, a lot of planning. And as the kind of global geopolitics are shifting, India's ambitions have also shifted, right? It's got a much more proactive, much more global and regional ambition. And now kind of more public recognition of the fact that China is a topic they have had ignored, but now actually it's back and it's very important. And this might be a serious contender and a competition for India from now on. How does this all come together in how Indian foreign policy elite see the world, how it sees itself in it, in the region, and all these kind of gigantic geopolitical shifts that we're observing in global structures?
Right. So I think, we can see Indian foreign policy, I mean, and this is not just in recent past, but in the long-term past, it's having 5 big themes, or at least as the centerpiece of their efforts. The first is internal balancing, which is, India is still a developing economy, has a per capita income of about $2,000 per person, which is still quite low, but it has been growing at a pretty healthy clip since 2000 or so. Coronavirus, of course, puts a lot of that into question. I think we'll discuss that later. But I think one effort has been how to strengthen itself at home, whether it's militarily, technologically, economically, and so forth. So I think that there are a lot of efforts on that. And how much does that? What kind of relationships does India need to get into with the other major powers, the major economies, including China, sometimes to achieve those objectives? The second theme has been in the sort of near neighborhood, which is ensuring us a peaceful periphery, particularly with some of the smaller countries in South Asia and just beyond. So Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Maldives. And these are all, these are all countries that are democratizing actually in their own ways, and that is leading to a different set of challenges as India engages with them. We've seen, for example, a greater Chinese role in all of these countries, whether it's political, economic, or military. So that remains a sort of major preoccupation and major challenge. And while efforts have been made, for example, India and Bangladesh sorted out their boundary disputes in 2014, 2015, very recently, there are still a lot of, with Nepal, for example, right now we have a sort of an aggravated crisis that India has to deal with. Similar on the neighborhood side, there's a different set of problems or challenges related to Pakistan and Afghanistan. With Pakistan, at least the Indian power disparity has increased in some ways, but it remains a major source of, not just from a domestic political point of view, but there still is an issue of state-backed terrorist groups that are operating across the line of control with India, and attacking Indian. Recently, it's been mostly military and police facilities, but in the past, it has been civilians as well. So that, and that is also very closely tied to Afghanistan as well, and the situation there. So the Afghanistan-Pakistan challenge, in some ways focused on terrorism, remains another major preoccupation. A fourth area, I think, is the larger one, which is really about the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region, really driven by the rise of China. And that has now opened up more questions about, for India, about what to do about in Asia, wider Asia, where China is much more active, as far as the Western Indian Ocean and East Africa. And so this has now necessitated collaborations with a whole new range of partners, the US chief among them, but also Japan, Australia, Southeast Asia, and others as well. Including actually traditional partners like Russia and France as well. So this I think is another priority. And the fifth and final one, I'd say, is global governance. So ensuring that India has a space and a voice at the global high table, so that major decisions, at least it has a say in shaping major global decisions, and whether that's at the United Nations or other international fora. Now, the one theme across all of these is actually China. Whether it has to do with internal balancing, whether it has to do with the neighborhood, whether it has to do with Pakistan, and China and Pakistan have a very close relationship, security driven, but increasingly economic as well. Whether it has to do with global governance or the balance of power, China is the common factor in all of them. And so in some ways you could actually summarize a lot of Indian trends in foreign policy as really coming to terms with China's rise. As India has risen at a pretty healthy pace, China has outpaced India, and what coming to terms with that is really the big challenge.
Yeah, and I think that relates to also the other big relationship in that dynamic, which is the United States, right? Yeah. So United States is obviously very much focused at the moment on the questions that arises from China's new position, something that has built up. It's been talked about, but I think the COVID-19 kind of has made that question much more immediate for a lot of people. And obviously, Trump administration does not shy away from raising escalation card but also interestingly, Trump himself too been to New Delhi. There has been a push for closer relationships between India and United States, and even in India, you see a lot more signs about the need for engagement with United States more. You already hinted at the quadruple kind of relationship between Australia and Japan and United States vis-a-vis the question of China purchasing of US attack helicopters, search and rescue helicopters, and etc. Do you see the China question drawing India closer to US and the US-led alliance? Or again, is this going to be some sort of strategic balancing act where India will try to come closer to US, but at the same time really not burn bridges with China and hopefully not get stuck in this escalation between China and United States?
Right. I mean, I don't think it's so clearly either or. In some ways, this has been a challenge that India has seen coming, at least with China, since 1998. In fact, China was given as one of the justifications for India conducting its nuclear tests in 1998, which was the concerns about that competition with China. But I think a bigger factor was in 2005 when India and the US entered into a civil nuclear agreement. It took 3 years to negotiate and finalize, but that really was driven in large part by both the India and the US by concerns about China, and that basically entering into a civil nuclear agreement would actually set the stage for a high technology and defense relationship between India and the United States, which would contribute to balancing against a rising China. So I think that in some ways this was long anticipated, and China remains a driving factor in the India-US relationship. I think quite clearly. It's been complicated by a number of things. So on the one hand, you have seen a pretty steady continuity. There have been some periods of acceleration from Bush to Obama to Trump. And you can't really say that about too many other relationships the US has. And similarly, there's been continuity on the Indian side from the Vajpayee government to Manmohan Singh to Modi, who's the current prime minister. But despite that, I think I think you will very much see India acting outside, what the US has become very comfortable with, which is a sort of a hub and spoke alliance structure in Asia, which it has these Cold War era relationships with Japan and Australia that are being revitalized. With India, it's a very different type of relationship. And I don't think, the reason I think we'll shy away from seeing a sort of US-India alliance per se is that at this point, I don't see India and the US wanting to commit to supporting each other in their own tussles with China. What we will see happen, I think, are a few things. One is increasing information sharing, whether it's strategic assessments at the political level or intelligence assessments on a day-to-day level, and we're already seeing that happen. Second is we'll see greater interoperability, so there are much more military exercises between the two countries, but also they just signed, for example, a secure communications agreement. So we'll start seeing sort of real-time operational interoperability, particularly in the maritime domain first, but possibly in other domains as well. And I think the third thing is help with capacity building, and this is more a one-way thing. But India already uses at least 8 major platforms from that it has acquired from the United States, and including things like P-8I, maritime reconnaissance aircraft, which are quite sophisticated. So I think you will see these efforts underway to help India help itself in some ways by the United States.
Yeah, but India is always fascinating, Drew. I think, as you pointed out, it doesn't really want to go either or. I mean, it balances a lot of complex relationships at the same time. And Russia is another interesting layer of this too. Obviously, there's been already discussions about India purchasing S-400 missile systems, and even, I think, some offers from Russia for new submarines. And there's always been some sort of amicable relationship, but actually strategically it's still ambiguous, and I'm not really sure what it is. But so do you think this China question, the US question, and the current geopolitics and the direction of things is going to complicate the India-Russia relations, or are we going to see Russia step in, trying to again stir some of these tensions, or draw closer, or actually be more cautious with India?
So, this is in some ways an old defense relationship, and it's really been driven by defense particularly since about 1959, 1960. In 1971, India and the Soviet Union signed a treaty of friendship, effectively making India a sort of ally of the Soviet Union in the second half of the Cold War. During the 1990s, when the Russian economy tanked, this was actually a big important source of revenue for Russia, which was arms sales to countries, and India was the largest buyer at the time. And remains the largest market for Russian exports, defense exports. So, I think this is an old relationship, but what we've seen happen recently is, in some ways, on most major issues, you see India and Russia parting ways and differing in their views on a lot of things. That being said, in the near term, I think we will have to see some level of cooperation between India and Russia, at least from India's point of view. This is how they see it, for a few reasons. One is Russia still provides very important spares and maintenance for existing platforms, including some of the frontline fighters that India has, Sukhoi 30s. And that's sort of important to keep that relationship up. The second is they do provide some military equipment that others don't. And for example, nuclear propulsion for submarines, nuclear attack submarines, which India leases from Russia. The US, I don't see that on the cards in the near future. And that's very, India sees that as very important. The third is, I think there are real concerns about the Russia-China relationship becoming too close. And that for that reason, you've seen, for example, India be quite muted in its criticism of the Russian annexation of Crimea, for example, because there is a desire to not be too different from China's position on some of those issues. So I think, for a combination of these, and I'd say a fourth reason, all those declining influences on some cooperation at the UN and other multilateral efforts. So for all these reasons, I think there is a desire by India in the short term to maintain this relationship with Russia, or at least not make it a hostile or a difficult relationship. But the larger forces, I think, are conspiring against that effort. And it's also a very thin relationship. Trade is pretty negligible. It's grown a little bit in the last few years. The energy relationship is again, pretty modest. So I don't see, the longer term trends are in favor of India and Russia moving their own way. But in the short term, I think we will see these efforts at keeping things stable.
Yeah, and one final question, Dhruva, which you already mentioned at the start, which is the COVID-19 question, right? I mean, obviously India has acted very quickly and took some certain measures, and I think the current kind of infection rate is almost 500,000. Obviously, it's got a very large population and very dispersed population, and a lot of the domestic workers and others who went back to their kind of own homelands and home states and rural areas have possibly spread the virus more. How is India coping with the reality of the lockdown? lockdown and the pandemic. And what might this mean for the future of India's economic ambitions or domestic direction, if you like?
Right. Yeah. So I think we're in a very worrisome stage right now. On the one hand, India took very early action in terms of travel restrictions, initially against countries like China and Italy and South Korea, but eventually a complete travel ban, international travel ban, and then imposed a very early nationwide lockdown compared to a lot of other countries when the number of reported cases was still quite low. This lasted in two phases. The third phase finally saw some gradual lifting of those restrictions. This was very unpopular, it was very controversial at the time because it seemed like the number of cases were very low. But I think the good news is it may have kept it lower, at least delayed what we saw as an outbreak. What we've seen now in the last few weeks is a real increase and a very worrisome increase, and this may continue for another few weeks, where we have almost 15,000 cases now, confirmed cases every day. So basically, after the US, Brazil, and Russia, India is now has the highest number of cases. Fortunately, relatively few fatalities, partly because it seems a more youthful population, partly because of public awareness and things like that. The lockdown will actually have very severe consequences for the Indian economy. This was at a time when it was a bit vulnerable to begin with, but this is a largely consumer-driven economy. It's been basically driven by investment and consumption. The manufacturing and export sector is still not as large, but I think it comes at a particularly vulnerable time for the Indian economy anyway. So we will see quite likely a sharp contraction, at least for a quarter or two, and possibly even for the full year. So it really does put a dent on India's larger trajectory. The question is how well can India rebound from this? And there will be, there is some fiscal space and that's being used. But largely, I think this will be up to Indian industrial policy and whether if the government can set in motion a set of, put in place a set of industrial policies now in the next year, India may be able to bounce back much better than many others. But I think a lot of intermediary steps remain before we can ascertain that.
Thank you so much, Dhruva. This has been a very, very rich conversation with so much different sides of this, from history to border disputes to COVID-19 and India's foreign policy. And thanks to everybody who watched us. And you can see more of these videos that we produce at www.chacer.org.uk. Thank you.